I'm Kimberly C. Paul. As I travel throughout each state, I realize that death is just a moment. It is how we live until that moment that matters. Finding connection with friends, family, and complete strangers. Journey with me. This is the Live Well, Die Well Tour. Well, we're here today talking to Brad Macy, and I have to say I have learned so much from you in the last few weeks doing some research about where you came from, where you are, and the huge impact that you're having on dying patients in the United States. So welcome to Death by Design podcast, Brad.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Well, before we get started, talk to me, because you were a hospice nurse, and I love hospice nurses. What is always intriguing to me is, how does someone become a hospice nurse? What was your interest in working with the dying?
Yeah, that's always an interesting question. So I really think we call it a calling, really. I was just drawn to it. My father died when I was 5, and my mother died when I was relatively young, in my 20s. And I lost a lot of my uncle and other people died. So I had a lot of death in my family. And I think part of that was what drew me to it. But I found myself, when I was working in the hospital, constantly being drawn to the bedside of the patients that were dying and the families that were around them. And everybody was saying, "You're supposed to hang that IV bag. What are you doing?" And so I really found myself drawn to it. And beyond that, I think it's really a calling.
I have to tend to agree with you. So how long were you a hospice nurse?
So I practiced for about 25 years.
Oh, that's all?
Yeah.
That's a long time, 20 years. Wow.
Yeah. I started doing after-hours visits for a large hospice in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they kind of recruited me. They said, "Why don't you come work for us?" Because I was contracting for them, doing their after-hours visits, and then I started working for them. So it was a wonderful journey. I started doing case management, did that for a few years, and then I really was drawn to after-hours nursing care. And I think part of it was the challenge and excitement of walking into a situation and not knowing what I was dealing with, and meeting the different players within the patient's circle and trying to figure out who could advance the care of that patient. How could I get that patient comfortable? All of those things, the factors that we have to do, because we're not just trying to get a patient comfortable, we're trying to get that family comfortable with also. So, a patient may be suffering with pain and symptoms, but a family is suffering a lot of times with the journey of watching a loved one die. And so really it's our job to try to help everybody. And sometimes the monotony of the day work was not something that I was drawn to. So I kind of like the Lone Ranger excitement of being out there after hours.
That must be your superpower, because to meet families in the middle of the night, where we have to admit the majority of deaths occur death doesn't happen 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. It happens 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so talk to me a little bit about your interest in how you dealt with the patient possibly in pain at night, but also the pain that the family members were dealing with in a totally different way. And how did that bridge to what you're doing now?
In my experience, I found that when I would go out to a patient's house, a lot of times we would be giving medication orally, and the patient would stop the abilities, they would have lost the ability to swallow. I dealt with patients a lot of times, most of the time, I was dealing with patients when symptoms were escalating as the after hours nurse. So I saw a lot of pain and suffering in my time, whether it was agitation or just plain pain, nausea or vomiting, and other symptoms. And when patients were unable to swallow, all of a sudden you had a situation where patients weren't able to get the medication they needed. And if it was 3 in the morning, how do you get that medication into that patient? And our go to is usually what's called sublingual, which means underneath the tongue. And what we would do is we would give a lot of the medications that we had been giving where the patient would swallow that medication. We would then put that medication underneath the patient's tongue and hope for the best. Well, in my experience, I found that about 80% of the time that worked okay. But about 20% of the time, it didn't work. And we ended up chasing what we used to call chasing symptoms. And we would increase the dosage and hope for the best. And then an hour later, we'd increase the dose again. It was extremely stressful and challenging for family members, obviously, and horrible for the patient. So, it leads to the story of the invention of the Macy Catheter. I had a patient one night with severe terminal agitation. His son was caring for him at the house, and he'd promised his father that he would die peacefully and that he would die at home. And I went out at 3 in the morning, and this poor guy was just climbing out of bed, really climbing the walls. And I had given him a sedative. He couldn't swallow. He wouldn't swallow. He was just too agitated. I had given him a sedative rectally in tablet form. And I wait to get him comfortable about an hour, talked to the son, tried to give the son emotional support. And then he was worse. And I got an order to repeat that dose. And when I tried to repeat it, I actually noticed that the tablets had not dissolved inside his body. Uh, and that was my aha moment. It's like, oh my gosh, our patients are dehydrated at the end of life a lot of times, and they're on medicines that dry the mucous membranes. So that medicine was never going to absorb in his body. So I ground up the tablets. I just thought on my feet. I ground up the tablets and I added water to them and I injected them with a small tube into his rectum. And I watched the symptoms melt away from him. He just calmed down, he relaxed, and he went to sleep in 15 minutes. And that was my aha moment that, wow, this rectal route, it's what we call microenema now. I didn't know that back then, but it's a microenema way of giving medications, and it works very fast and very well.
Well, when you were with that patient, that first patient that you did this with, did you think, oh, I'm going to create something? Because there's a gap here when it comes to individuals dying that are dying in pain. And the way that we have done it, those 20% of people are not being able to be reached and comfortable. Did you realize you were going to create something?
Certainly not at the time. I was in the moment. I was really in the moment. It was like I had a patient that was suffering, and I had to figure out a way. We pride ourselves as after hours nurses coming up with ways to jimmy rig things to deal with the situation at hand. And that's all. That's all I really was trying to do. Was I just the worst thing for me in my entire practice was I could deal with the family issues and all of the challenges, but watching a patient suffer and not being able to do anything about it was incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult for hospice nurses. It's probably one of the biggest reasons for burnout, and this why this year has been so hard on nurses with the COVID epidemic. It just we don't go into this to watch people suffer and be out of control and not be able to do it. So that was my motivation. I don't want to do this, and so when I realized that it worked so well, obviously I wanted to do it again, and so I started to use it as a practice. On other patients. And it worked. It worked for pain. It worked for seizures. It worked for nausea and vomiting. It worked for shortness of breath. It was working for everything. And then, of course, the case managers who came on the next day would ask me, why is there a tube in my patient's rectum? Whatever it is, we want to do it because our families are telling us that you're a lifesaver, that you made this patient comfortable, and that they're forever grateful. So we did adopt it into practice at my agency. And then other agencies began to ask me through my leadership with the Hospice and Palliative Nurses Association, started to ask me, would you train us how to do this? Because this is a need that we need. And it was at that point that I realized that I had something that really was a deep need in across the hospice arena, and that was when I decided to create a product.
So talk to me. I mean, was it hard leaving hospice to create another organization? I mean, it's called the Macy Catheter. And what's interesting is that it's not widely known yet. And so this is the one reason you and I are talking, because if we can get that other 20% of patients who are facing end of life out of pain and comfortable for both the patient and family's sake, then we got to have more conversations about this.
Yeah, that's right. So, it's interesting. So I started this journey I think we started Hospice about 8 years ago, and we went through the FDA approval process and then launched into the market in 2014. And we got early adopter agencies who just got it right away and adopted it and started using it. And then there's a thing called the chasm where whenever you introduce a new technology, a disruptive technology into any kind of a market, there's early adopters, and then there's something called a chasm where you need the evidence base, you need all of the research and stuff behind it before you get the later adopters to use. And that's really what we've been doing now, is getting the evidence base. And I believe it's there. We're there now. We have the evidence base that it's more effective than subcutaneous and more effective than sublingual and more comfortable. So, hospices across the country are using this now. I think it's all 50 states. There's at least one hospice that's using the catheter, but we have a long way to go. It takes a little bit of time for hospices to change, even if they know, for instance, quality scores, the CAP scores that the government does show that right now that 1 in 10 patients report that, or not patients, but their families report that the patient never or rarely had their symptoms controlled. Now, nobody's perfect, right? But my opinion, 1 in 10, we could do better, in the industry. We could do better than 1 in 10 patients' families reporting that they never had their symptoms controlled. So that's kind of my mission. My mission is to change is to change that. Slowly but surely, it's happening.
Well, let me ask you a question because we both, and I know this for a fact, we both love the hospice field and those working in this hospice field. Do you feel like, but I also, I love it so much that I'm almost a critic of it because we in the hospice, and I say we, I'm working, at a hospice right now, but we in the hospice world tend to have a hard time with change. We're not, some of us are not early adopters. And I think that, do you feel, because I feel this Macy Catheter, because you hit it right on the head a few minutes ago, it is painful for a hospice nurse to see a patient in pain. So I think it's a trifecta here. Not only is it for the patient and the family, but also the caregiver at the bedside called the hospice nurse, who has to think on their feet. And I think this is a solution for us. And I want to know, what is your opinion? How do we get more hospices to adopt this? Do you think it's education?
Yeah, I do. I really think it's education. And education not only of the hospice nurses, but also of the general public. And, that's why I appreciate what you're doing so much, is that people have the power to decide the path that they're on, where they're going, what their journey is going to be. And everybody our journey will always end in death. And we have the power to decide what that journey looks like. So what I want potential caregivers of patients in hospice or patients in hospice know is that you really have a choice and a decision about the hospice that you choose, and that there is a way to control symptoms, even in the home setting. You don't have to be in a facility. You can have your symptoms controlled really well in the home setting. And I think, when the public starts to ask, how do you deal with my symptoms? If my pain were to escalate out of control and I was unable to swallow, how would you handle those? If the public started to ask hospices that, I think that would change. That there would be more looking for solutions.
Well, we all know that the majority of who has changed healthcare has been the public. I mean, look at the birthing. The birthing doulas that came. I want to have my baby in the tub, and it is motivated by the individual, called the community members, who have radically changed some aspects of healthcare. So I hats off, because I do believe educating the public more about options could be a game changer for the Macy Catheter as well. But there are hospices out there that have their heads down, and there's so many acute patients that it's not like they don't want to be innovative. They just don't know what the innovation is. So how do we get to those hospice? Talk to me about, if a hospice is listening, if a case manager or someone's listening right now, and they're like, I want to know more about what this is. How do they get in touch with you? Do you provide training? Talk to me a little bit about your processes when it comes to people who are really interested in implementing the Macy Catheter.
So, we actually do have an entire training program. So in fact, it's extremely important that the launch of the program, we have the policy and procedure, we have the training. We really work with the agency to get the catheter adopted, not because how to place a catheter is easy. When and why I want to change my practice is the difficult question. And we teach in that so that we help nurses understand, oh, okay, I understand it now. Mrs. Jones has severe symptoms. She's a great candidate for the Macy Catheter because sublingual, we're going to be chasing symptoms on her. So those are the types of things that we train. So, anybody can reach out to Hospice from our website, which is macycatheter.com. It's pretty easy to remember. And somebody, you can talk to our CHPN, Betsy King, who's always on chat, and ask her, say, I want to know more about the catheter. Pretty easy to reach out to us.
Now, if a hospice nurse is at a bedside today and they are chasing symptoms with a patient, I mean, if they do, can they order the Macy catheter through like the pharmacy, or do they specifically have to go through you for the training and have that already on hand to help symptom controls?
They really have to have the catheter available, and they need a physician's or nurse practitioner's order to use it. So, and then they need to know, obviously, how to place it at all and teach the family to use it.
So there's a lot of pre-thinking, and this is why it's so important to get in touch with you guys now to get that training, to have the catheters. So when we are chasing symptoms of someone facing end of life, that you ask for an order. But get this, I mean, do you feel like if I called and said, hey, Dr. Smith, I need an order for a Macy catheter, do you think the physician would even know?
It depends. It depends on the physician and how aware of new technology they are. We're obviously at the conferences, and most people who frequent the conferences know about the Macy catheter. But if a physician or a nurse doesn't frequent the national conferences or the local conferences, they may not know about new technology. So that would be the answer to that. And
do you guys provide? I mean, do you guys help hospice organizations educate their local physicians about Macy catheter in a way that would support something like this via Zoom, or maybe you have videos? I mean, how does that? I mean, are y'all willing to help educate local physicians to support individuals?
Yeah. So, I kind of do the circuit, and I do training or I do lectures at the local and national conferences. But we also have a wonderful education platform now, and I'm really, really proud of it. It's through the Relias, which is a large national.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Relias.
So we partnered with Relias to set up what we call the Hospice Academy, and we have 10 free nursing CEs on there. I'm trying to add one a month because I absolutely believe that education is the key to good care in hospice, and that nurses who continually engage in education, the latest technology in hospice and palliative care, just they've got the keys to better care. So that on that platform is actually a session for the prescriber, which is a session that I did for physicians and nurse practitioners that talks about the Macy catheter, how to order it, what medications can be given, the pharmacokinetics, the evidence base for the catheter's effectiveness and comfort versus the other options. All of that stuff is on one of the webinars that I have. So education is, like you said, is absolutely key, Kim.
So, before we wrap up, let's talk about any of the listeners listening now. We're talking about the Macy catheter. We in the hospice field know that there's always about 20% of individuals who are having a hard time swallowing, and we're always chasing pain symptoms. And this Macy catheter can solve a lot of those individuals who are unable to swallow pain medication. And so how do people get in touch with you and get more information?
So what I recommend for caregivers is that they really approach their hospice because we, as a company, we can't send a catheter directly to a patient or caregiver. We need that physician order, and we need the buy-in from the hospice agency because they're the ones that are providing the care to that patient. So what I recommend and what is really important is that when you're talking, maybe you're talking to a discharge planner about hospices, and they're saying, here's 5 hospices, that you can choose from. Is you ask, do any of those hospices, do you know if they use the Macy catheter? Or how do they deal with difficult symptoms in case I have, because some people, like I said, 80% of folks have, can take a little bit of medicine under their tongue and do just fine. It's that 20% of patients, and a lot of times it's the difficult cancers that cause a lot of pain. Asking those questions of discharge planners or interviewing hospices and saying, how do you deal with difficult symptoms in case I get to a point where I can't swallow and I have difficult symptoms? How will you keep me comfortable? And I think it's a really good question for people to ask agencies.
I love it. I love it. Give us your website once more.
So it's www.macycatheter.com, MACY catheter.com.
And I have to say, Brad, what I love is that you were at the bedside and you saw this gap and you took the initiative to close it. And I just want to say thank you for all of those individuals that have benefited from your innovative thinking on your feet and creating the Macy catheter. And
I love the new name for it, the Mercy catheter.
Yeah, always figure that I could, create new names out of nowhere for anyone. But, thank you so much for your time. And I would really love to do some more work here in Denver, Colorado, to do some education, to really get this word out. Because at the end of the day, it is about the patient and the family. And how can we keep that patient comfortable? That really is a ripple effect in keeping that family comfortable, especially in this dying process. So thank you so much. And I would like to reach out to you and really think about how can we approach the Denver market of really educating people about, this catheter that can radically change how people in that 20% who can't swallow control their pain and symptom at the end of life. So I look forward to continuing this conversation, but I also just thank you for being innovative and thinking on your feet and always caring about the patient and family.
Well, thank you, Kim. Yeah, it's been a wonderful journey. I've really enjoyed every moment of it. It's very rewarding.
Well, thanks for joining us today, and I look forward to working in collaboration with you and changing that every hospice in the United States, let's start there, needs to be aware of this. So again, I look forward to working with you in the future. And Brad, thank you so much for just who you are and the impact that you're having on hospice patients and families.
Thank you, Kim.
Thanks for joining us today. And remember, you're the designer. This podcast is produced by Jason Andre with 7 Season Films. If you're interested in telling your story via podcast, look him up.